The house smelled like lilies and lies the morning my grandfather was buried. I know that sounds dramatic. Maybe it is. But when you've spent 31 years watching your family treat you like a footnote in their story, drama is just another word for the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. My grandfather, Harold Eugene Whitfield, was what you'd call old money with new habits. He'd built his fortune the hard way: decades of real estate, a few brilliant investments nobody believed in at the time, and a stubbornness that made lesser men quit before lunchtime. By the time I was born, he was already a millionaire. By the time I turned 10, he'd crossed into territory that people in our town whispered about at church and gossiped over at the diner. Billionaire. The word sat heavy in every room he walked into, and somehow even heavier in the rooms he left. He was also the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I mattered. My dad, his son, was a different story entirely. Gerald Whitfield inherited his father's last name and precisely none of his father's wisdom. He spent most of my childhood chasing shortcuts, borrowing against whatever goodwill Grandpa Harold still had left for him, and treating my mother like an inconvenience until she finally stopped being one altogether and moved to Phoenix with a man named Dale who owned a carpet cleaning business. I was 12 when she left. Nobody asked me how I felt about it. My brother, Marcus, was 5 years older than me and had made a career out of being our father's favorite. He laughed at all of Dad's jokes, echoed all of Dad's opinions, and had mastered the particular art of disappearing whenever something hard needed to be done, but reappearing the moment credit was being handed out. He was charming in the way that empty spaces can seem full if you don't look too closely. I was the quiet one. The one who graduated college on scholarships they never congratulated me for, the one who built a small but honest bookkeeping business out of a spare bedroom while Dad borrowed money from Grandpa and called it an investment, the one who drove Grandpa Harold to his medical appointments for the last 4 years of his life because Marcus was always too busy and Dad was always too proud to admit the man he'd spent a lifetime disappointing might actually need help. Grandpa Harold and I used to sit on his back porch after those appointments, drinking iced tea and watching the garden his wife, my grandmother, Clara, gone now 15 years, had planted and loved. He didn't talk much during those drives, but on that porch, he talked plenty. He told me about the first property he ever bought, a broken-down duplex in a neighborhood nobody wanted, that he fixed up with his own 2 hands over 3 weekends because he couldn't afford to pay anyone else. He told me about the mistakes he made, the deals that fell through, the nights he wasn't sure he'd make payroll for the 2 employees he had in 1971. He told me that the most important thing he'd ever learned in business wasn't about money at all. It was about reading people, knowing who was there because of what you had and who was there because of who you were. He always said that last part looking at me sideways, like there was a second meaning tucked underneath it. I was too polite to ask what he meant back then. Now I think I always knew. He passed on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in the chair by the window in his bedroom where the morning light came through the curtains just right. His housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, found him with a book still open in his lap and a cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime in the night. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. I believe that. Harold Whitfield did everything on his own terms, including leaving. The funeral was large and polished and full of people I'd never seen visit him once while he was alive. My dad gave a speech that managed to make his own grief sound like an achievement. Marcus sat in the front row looking appropriately devastated in a suit I knew cost more than my monthly rent. I sat 2 rows back and said nothing. 3 days after the burial, we were called to the office of Grandpa Harold's attorney, a composed, gray-haired woman named Eleanor Voss, who had been managing Harold's legal affairs for over 2 decades. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9 a.m. My dad had barely been able to contain himself since the funeral. He kept making phone calls in hushed tones and talking about liquidity and estate planning like he'd done anything to earn the right to those words. Marcus had already started talking about the vacation he was going to take, to Europe, first class. I drove myself to the attorney's office in my 2017 Honda Civic. I wore the blue dress I'd bought on sale 2 years ago for a client presentation. I brought a travel mug of coffee and found a parking spot on the street 2 blocks away because the garage was $6 and I had a business to keep running. I didn't know walking through those glass doors that Thursday morning that my life was about to change in a way I hadn't let myself imagine. I didn't know that the $50 I was about to receive, the only thing with my name on it in that entire will, was the most carefully calculated gift my grandfather had ever given anyone. And I didn't know that 2 days later, a bank manager would look at me across a counter, stare at what I'd handed him, and freeze completely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened in that room first. Eleanor Voss's conference room was the kind of space that made money feel serious. Dark wood table, high-backed chairs with leather so stiff it practically announced your net worth the moment you sat down. A row of windows looking out over the downtown skyline, which on a March morning was gray and flat, and somehow appropriate. There were fresh flowers on the credenza, white orchids, and a tray of water glasses nobody touched. There were 6 of us besides Eleanor and her assistant, my father and his wife Renata, a woman he'd married 4 years ago who had very strong opinions about interior decorating and very little interest in anyone who wasn't going to advance those opinions. My brother Marcus and his girlfriend Tasha, who spent the first 10 minutes of waiting time looking something up on her phone that she kept tilting away from me. A distant cousin named Paul, who none of us had seen in at least 5 years, and who I suspect had only shown up based on a rumor about the estate, and me. Nobody saved me a seat at the table. I pulled out a chair near the far end, set my travel mug to my right, and folded my hands in my lap and waited. My father glanced at me when I sat down, one of those glances that isn't really a greeting so much as a brief inventory. I was accounted for, moving on. Eleanor Voss entered at exactly 9 o'clock. She had the bearing of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times that difficulty itself had become routine. She set a folder on the table, adjusted her glasses, and thanked us all for coming without sounding particularly grateful that any of us had come. Then she opened the folder and began to read. The estate, she explained, had been valued at the time of Harold Whitfield's death at approximately $240 million. She said it the way you might say the weather forecast, factual, expected, no particular emphasis. Across the table, I watched my father's jaw relax in a way it never quite did in daily life. Marcus exhaled slowly. Renata shifted forward half an inch. The distributions were as follows. To Gerald Whitfield, my father, Harold had left $38 million, along with the deed to a commercial property in the business district of our city that generated significant rental income. My father smiled when Eleanor said the number, not a big smile, a contained one, the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time for something and was trying very hard to look like he hadn't been. To Marcus Whitfield, my brother, Harold had left $22 million, the vacation house on the lake 2 hours north of the city, and a portfolio of 3 rental properties in the suburbs that Eleanor noted were fully occupied and producing steady income. Marcus laughed, an actual, quiet laugh, and immediately apologized for it. Tasha grabbed his hand under the table. To Paul, the cousin, a lump sum of $1.2 million, described as a gesture of family goodwill. Paul nodded vigorously. He would be nodding for the rest of his life. Then Eleanor paused. She turned a page, she looked up at me over her glasses, and something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else in that room would have caught, but I caught it. A brief, almost imperceptible steadiness, like she was bracing something or holding something carefully in place. She said, "To my granddaughter, Lydia Ann Whitfield," she always used my full name, Grandpa Harold, even at his most casual, "I leave the sum of $50 in cash in the envelope marked with her name, which she will find in her hands at the conclusion of this reading." The room went very quiet. And then it didn't. My father's smile disappeared so fast it was almost funny. He straightened in his chair. Marcus made a sound in the back of his throat that he quickly turned into a cough. Renata whispered something to my father behind the back of her hand. Paul looked at the ceiling. Tasha went back to her phone. Nobody looked at me. I said nothing. Eleanor continued to read. There were charitable foundations named, a hospital, a scholarship fund, a land conservation trust that would receive the majority of the remaining estate. She read through the legal language with practiced evenness. When she finished, she looked around the room, confirmed there were no immediate questions regarding the formal terms of the will, and passed a small envelope across the table toward me. White envelope, my name on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. I held it in both hands for a moment. The room was already moving. My dad was asking Eleanor about the timeline for the commercial property transfer. Marcus was excusing himself to take a call. Paul was thanking Eleanor profusely and looking for his coat. Everyone busy. Everyone already calculating. I opened the envelope at the table, quietly, while the room reorganized itself around me. Inside was a single $50 bill. Old but crisp, the kind of old that means it's been kept somewhere safe, not circulated, chosen. And in the bottom left corner of the bill, in the faint blue ink of a fine point pen, my grandfather had written something so small I had to bring it close to my face to read it. It was a number, just a number, 7 digits, printed carefully the way a man in his 80s prints things when he wants you to read it, followed by 2 letters, initials that I recognized immediately. They were the initials of a bank I had never personally done business with, a private bank downtown, old money, the kind of institution that doesn't advertise because it doesn't need to. I folded the bill, slipped it back into the envelope, put the envelope in my purse. My father noticed me standing to leave and made the kind of comment that sounds like nothing but means everything. He said, "Well, at least he remembered you." Marcus laughed. I smiled at my father, the way you smile at someone when you have decided completely and finally that their opinion of you is no longer something you're going to carry. Then I picked up my travel mug, said goodbye to no one in particular, and walked out. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, I drove downtown and walked through the doors of that private bank. Whitmore Private Bank had been on Hargrove Street since 1952. The kind of building that doesn't try to impress you because it has nothing to prove. Polished granite steps, brass fixtures, a heavy door that opened without a sound, a receptionist who greeted me before I was fully inside. Marble floors, actual art on the walls, the kind you can tell has been there for decades. No lines, no ticket numbers, no rope barriers. I asked to speak with a branch manager and said I had an account matter to discuss. I didn't know if I had an account. I only knew that number written in my grandfather's careful handwriting on the face of a $50 bill. But I said it like I belonged there, because Harold Whitfield had once told me that the most important thing you can do in any unfamiliar room is act like you already know something. A man named Richard Holloway came to meet me. He was maybe 60, trim, in a gray suit that had been pressed with genuine intention. He had the measured warmth of someone trained to make high-net-worth clients feel comfortable, and he led me to a private office off the main floor with the kind of quiet efficiency that told me this was not unusual. I sat down. He offered me water. I accepted. Then I took the $50 bill from the envelope and placed it on the desk between us. I told him I believed this number, written here, might be associated with an account connected to my late grandfather, Harold Eugene Whitfield. I told him Grandpa Harold had passed 3 weeks ago, and that his estate had been formally administered. I said I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, just that Harold had clearly wanted me to come here. Richard Holloway looked at the number on the bill. He looked at it for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he looked up at me, and he froze. It wasn't the freeze of someone who didn't know what to say, it was the freeze of someone who knew exactly what to say and was taking a moment to prepare for the weight of saying it. He excused himself. He was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on his wall without meaning to. When he came back, he had a folder under his arm and a woman with him who introduced herself as the head of private client services. She shook my hand with both of hers. The number on the bill, Richard Holloway explained, was a trust account number. A trust account Harold Whitfield had established 22 years ago. I was 6 years old when he opened it. It had been structured as a blind trust, meaning the beneficiary had no knowledge of or access to it until the conditions of activation were met. The conditions, as written into the legal trust document at the time of its creation, were specific. The trust would only activate upon the presentation of the $50 bill bearing the account number by the named beneficiary, Lydia Ann Whitfield, in person at this institution. The bill itself was the key. I asked him what the trust contained. He opened the folder. Over 22 years, the trust had been funded quietly, steadily, and with remarkable intention. Real estate holdings, 3 properties in high-growth corridors of the city, fully paid, generating income for years. A diversified investment portfolio seeded with an initial deposit and grown with the careful direction of the bank's private wealth team, which Harold had authorized to manage it actively. A cash reserve account, and a personal letter from Harold, sealed, dated 2 months before his death, addressed to me and only me. The total value of the trust as of the date I walked through those doors was approximately $19,400,000. I did not cry in that office. I have thought about that often since, why I didn't cry. I think it was because it didn't feel like a surprise exactly. It felt like a recognition, like something I had always suspected but had never let myself trust, that Harold saw me, that he had always seen me, that every quiet conversation on that back porch, every appointment I drove him to, every afternoon I sat with him while the rest of the family found better things to do, he had been paying attention the whole time. And so had I. I asked if Richard Holloway could have a moment alone before we discussed next steps. He said, of course. He left the room. The woman from Private Client Services set a box of tissues on the corner of the desk before she closed the door behind her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I read the letter. I won't share everything he wrote. Some things are only meant for 2 people, even when one of them is no longer here. But I will tell you this. He said he'd watched me for years, the real me, not the version my father decided I was, not the version my brother never bothered to look at long enough to form an opinion about. He said he'd watched me build something honest and quiet and worth being proud of, and that he believed I already had every quality I needed to do something remarkable with what he was leaving me. He said the $50 wasn't an insult, it was a key, and that the reason he left it as a key rather than naming me openly in the will was deliberate. He didn't want what he was giving me to be something the family could fight over, claim, contest, or diminish. He wanted it to reach me clean, untouched, completely mine. He ended the letter the way he ended all of our conversations. He said, "You always knew who was there for who you were." I didn't call my father. I didn't text Marcus. I didn't post anything on social media or tell a single person for weeks. I met with the private client team. I hired an independent financial advisor on their recommendation, a woman named Judith with 30 years of experience and no patience for people who wasted her time, and we spent 2 months quietly learning the full scope of what I had inherited, the properties, the accounts, the income streams already running, the decisions that needed to be made with care and without rushing. I kept running my bookkeeping business, I kept my apartment, I kept my car, not because I had to, but because those things were mine too, and I'd built them myself, and there was nothing about suddenly having more that required me to pretend the life I had already created wasn't worth having. My father found out eventually. I'm not sure exactly how, whether Eleanor Voss communicated something in the estate administration process, or whether someone at the bank talked, or whether the property transfers simply became visible through public records at some point. But he called me on a Tuesday in June. He said, "I heard about the trust." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then he asked why Harold hadn't told anyone. I said, "Because it wasn't for anyone else." He didn't call back for a while after that. Marcus sent a text. It said, "Congratulations," and I could tell he'd typed and deleted other versions of that before sending that one. I replied with a smiley face, which I felt was the appropriate amount of response. I've thought a lot about what Grandpa Harold did, the structure of it, the patience it required, the 22 years of quiet intention that went into building something that only I could activate. There's a kind of love in that I don't have adequate words for. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was just there, consistent, building, the same way he built everything he ever had. People ask me sometimes, when I've eventually told this story in pieces to people I trust, what I thought when the bank manager froze, what was going through my mind in that moment. The truth is, in that exact moment, I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about iced tea on a back porch, and a garden my grandmother planted, and a man who looked at me like I mattered every single time. The $50 is framed now, on the wall of my home office, next to a photograph of the two of us from a Sunday afternoon 3 summers ago. Him in his chair, me beside him, both of us squinting into the light. The number is still visible in the corner if you look closely, the initials too. I look at it every morning when I sit down to work, and every morning it says the same thing. He knew.